Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us for this final webinar before I hope everyone gets to leave work a little bit early this afternoon to get ready for Thanksgiving. This is our final event on this series on unpacking the root causes of casework with the Casework Navigator program from the PopVox Foundation. And this has been such a fun series. We're delighted to cap it off today. Last week, we heard from Max Guinness at Policy Engine on tools for understanding the complexity of how different programs interact. And from Jennifer Palka, the author of Recoding America, on the agency structures and incentives that create the kludgocracy, which is a word I'm going to use wherever I can from now on, causing so many persistent casework problems. Both of those videos are now online at popvox.org/casework, and I would definitely recommend throwing them on in the background while you are prepping the Thanksgiving meal tomorrow. Both of them were wonderful and really worth catching up on. And today, in our finale for the series, this is about the last big piece of equipment in your toolkit, which is the frameworks and language for understanding and talking about the impact that this confusion and kludge has on your constituents in a way that can help translate your insights into those constituent experiences into, ideally, some policy action. And before we get started, we actually have a special guest who wanted to say a few words to introduce today's talk.
Kilmer here from Washington's 6th Congressional District. It's an honor to address you all today, albeit virtually, at this event. Let's address the elephant in the room, administrative burden. As a member of Congress, it pains me to know that the very system meant to aid my constituent often poses barriers for them. When individuals are struggling to access the benefits they are legally entitled to, the system isn't just failing them, it's failing us all. That's where you come into play. It's a hard truth that many of you as caseworkers face challenges that arise not just from the complexities of individual cases, but from systemic obstacles. Every day, you confront a web of bureaucracy trying to make sense of it for the folks you serve. Every day, you have the power to help constituents through your roles, but you also face a lot of challenges. The good news is there is hope and bipartisan efforts in the works to better help you and help our constituents. That's an issue the Select Committee on the Modernization of Congress worked on, and one that remains a top priority for the House Administration's Committee Subcommittee on Modernization. So, for example, we offered and are actively implementing recommendations related to CRS, providing regularly updated and complete information on local agency casework contacts and agency digital privacy relief form policies. In fact, I wrote a bipartisan bill that I will introduce soon to make this happen, called the In Case Act. We recommended a smoother process for the handoff of open casework in the event a case remains open after a member leaves office to prevent disruption for the constituent. We continue to make progress on that topic. We're also close to getting handbook updates that would allow caseworkers and constituent services teams to share resource lists, including for non-federal help like food banks and veteran service organizations or domestic violence shelters, for constituents we want to help and know how to help, but that we aren't able to help because of the way the handbook is currently written. We're also close to being allowed to co-sponsor constituent service events in the district with local government organizations and groups. Imagine a housing fair or a tax clinic or a jobs fair, for example. We recommended giving district offices a platform to learn from each other. And it may be a simple Teams chat, but I know it has helped my office and others. I'm glad the chance for offices to more easily collaborate on shared problems now exists. But it's not just about understanding the obstacles constituents face. It's about grasping the underlying reasons for their inquiries, tracking the various types of casework, and then channeling this knowledge to our policy staff. By doing so, we can build more responsive and effective systems, lessening the burden on both our constituents and on you, our invaluable caseworkers. That's why the Select Committee recommended and we developed an optional system to allow offices to share anonymized constituent casework data and aggregate that information to identify trends and systemic issues to better serve our constituents. There is a real live pilot on this now, so please sign up. The House Digital Services is making that happen. So as we get into the nuances of administrative burden today, let's remember why we're here. We're here because every person who walks into our office seeking help represents a promise that their government will work for them. And every time you help a constituent navigate this maze, you help to reaffirm that promise. Professor Moynihan, thank you for illuminating this path for us. And to all the caseworkers here today, thank you for your hard work. It matters. So let's make the most of today's discussion, and I hope to see you all again soon. Take care.
Awesome. You heard it here first, folks. There's some really, really exciting stuff coming down the pipe from Committee on House Administration's Modernization Subcommittee to make casework easier and make it easier for all of you, hopefully, to spend less time on the nuts and bolts of the administrative burdens posed by our own casework systems and more on trying to translate those insights. Some of you may be familiar with the work of the CHA's Mod Sub and also the incredible leadership from Rep. Kilmer and the Modernization Committee. So thank you again, Rep. Kilmer. And we are so grateful for his work, especially as he's just announced his retirement at the end of this Congress. So let's go ahead and dive in. As Rep. Kilmer said, we are so excited to welcome Professor Donald Moynihan, inaugural McCourt Chair at Georgetown's McCourt School of Public Policy, Director of the Better Government Lab, and really one of the founders of the field of academic study focusing on administrative burden. Professor Moynihan's work focuses on understanding the ways burdens impact people interacting with government and how to make those interactions simple, accessible, and respectful, which I know is a shared goal for all of the caseworkers here today. Professor Moynihan will have a short presentation on the scope of his work, and we will have lots of time for Q&A. So go ahead and get your questions ready and drop those into the Q&A whenever you have them. Professor Moynihan, thank you so much for being here. Really appreciate it.
Thank you, and thanks for the lovely introduction for Representative Kilmer. It's wonderful to see folks in Congress pay attention to this issue, and thanks to everyone who's signing up to chat here the day before Thanksgiving. Hope you have a happy break. I'm going to start here by sharing my screen and going back to the start of my presentation, where first I want to credit my co-author Pamela Hurd here. We've been working on this topic for over a decade together. And as Anne pointed out, what we're interested in is a fairly simple observation that most of us, when we encounter government, would like that experience to be simple, accessible, and respectful. And those are the values that inform the research that we do and the advocacy that we undertake. So what are administrative burdens? We might think of this as the sort of frictions that people encounter in their experience with policy implementation. To break it down a little bit, we think about this in terms of three particular types of costs. And these costs are often the things that people remember most about the concept of administrative burdens, because it gives them a little bit of a handle to think about how these frictions are experienced. So learning costs are the idea that you have to spend time and effort in figuring out if you're eligible for a program or public service, and what you would have to do to apply for that. This ugly graph is a map of the choices one would have to make as a Medicare beneficiary. And this is, again, this is a choice that people are making when they're getting older and are maybe struggling to make sense of all of the options that are presented to them. It's one example of a program that is not intended to be burdensome, but because of the simple array of choices that are presented to people is felt that way. The second category is compliance costs, and we might think about this as the cost of following administrative rules and requirements. This includes filling out forms, time spent maybe waiting in line or at an office, if you have to travel somewhere, if you have to pull together documentation, if there's financial costs that come with some sort of process. And to give a couple of examples of compliance costs, I'll start by talking about Abel Sewell here. He was a leukemia survivor in the state of Tennessee who lost his Medicaid coverage after his family failed to complete a 49-page application form that was mailed to their home. And they said they never got the form, but it's fairly clear that the process of renewing these Medicaid forms was not working especially well. Only about 10% of over 320,000 forms that were sent out to these families got completed to allow people to renew benefits. So most people were struggling to complete these very long forms or had errors or delivered them late in such a fashion that they lost their benefits, and including benefits that they obviously wanted and needed to retain for life-threatening illnesses. Another example of the power of compliance costs here comes from the Great Unwinding. So since the end of the pandemic, the federal protections and additional funding for states to allow them to keep people on Medicaid has elapsed. So now the states are changing Medicaid processes and reintroducing traditional renewal processes. A couple of takeaways that will give you a sense of just how big a deal this is. So one study looked at the impact of coverage that was driven by the Affordable Care Act. So Obamacare, the implementation of that, and then it compared that to the effect of the increase in coverage from simply suspending Medicaid renewal processes during the pandemic. And it found that there was a bigger increase in coverage by simply suspending these renewal processes. And so that gives you a sense of how the biggest healthcare expansion that we've seen over previous decades, that we've fought about in elections and in Congress for a long time, had less of an effect on healthcare coverage than simply stopping annual renewal processes. Now that those renewal processes are back in place, we're estimating about this point, 11 million people have lost Medicaid coverage. And some of those are no longer eligible, but many of them still are. And we know there's about 7 out of 10 of those who are losing coverage are losing it for what's called procedural reasons. That is to say, the state cannot verify if they're eligible or ineligible because they don't have sufficient documentation. And so that documentation or compliance cost is having this enormous impact on families across America at the moment. The third type of costs are psychological costs. And we might think of these as falling into different subcategories. One could be the sort of sense of stigma that you experience if you feel embarrassed about participating in a certain type of program, or if you feel like you're being looked down upon. Another might be a sense of loss of autonomy. So humans have a basic need to experience some sense of autonomy over their person, and in some administrative processes, they might feel like they're being closely judged or have little control over the process. If these burdens are related to a program that's important for an individual, they might experience stress about losing a vital resource. In some cases, they might experience fear. So, for example, Hispanic families tend to have lower take-up of benefits, partly because of concerns about administrative questions about their status as whether they're documented or not. And the accumulation of this can result in frustration. So people might feel more or less frustrated about a process that didn't go well. And this is an example of a text that a colleague of ours shared from her niece when she was laid off during the pandemic, when she was just talking about how frustrating it was trying to get help for a program she was eligible for and feeling like that help was not there or was not easy for her to access. So why do these burdens matter? From our discussion of psychological costs, we might say, well, obviously they create some sort of psychological impact on us that can be frustrating, but it's not just that. There's a couple of other reasons we should care about burdens. Small burdens can have a big effect. So a new documentation requirement might have a much larger impact in terms of the reach or take-up of a program. Also, those effects might not be distributed equally. They might fall heavier on some groups more than others, meaning that burdens can be a source of inequality. And finally, we might worry that negative experiences of government services will make us more cynical and jaded about the capacity of government to help people. For some programs where we interact with government, we have no choice but to engage with them. And so this includes paying our taxes, but also completing tax documentation, where almost everyone completes a series of forms. And if you calculate the amount of time that people spend on this, by some estimates, it's about $200 billion worth of time each year. The IRS is going to experiment with a pilot next year in 13 states, where it's going to examine if it can pre-fill a direct filing process that will cut down on the amount of time people would spend on completing their taxes. So keep an eye on that. It also might make programs less effective. And so this is Elizabeth Cloinger. She's a resident of Arkansas who's on Medicaid benefits. And when Arkansas introduced work requirements a couple of years back, she was one of about 17,000 people who lost coverage. And she should have been eligible for the coverage because she was working sufficient number of hours. But like many, she struggled with the reporting process. So it wasn't necessarily the work requirement that was catching her out. It was the work reporting process. And so this was an online only process. A lot of people didn't know about it. One study in the New England Journal of Medicine estimated that 95% of those who lost Medicaid coverage as a result of these new requirements were actually eligible individuals, but they were simply caught up by the administrative burdens. Going back to this issue of inequality, the reason why inequality might arise is for a couple of different reasons. Sometimes scholars talk about differences between individuals in terms of human capital, and that can be related to lots of different things, like your level of education, your ability to understand administrative forms, your perseverance, the social network that you're in, things like your health status, or whether you're experiencing scarcity or instability in your life. So think about all of those things as a bundle of qualities we categorize as human capital. And we know that as you experience lower human capital in certain areas, so for example, if you're in poor health, or if you're experiencing financial scarcity, you're less likely to be able to complete administrative processes. You're more likely to fail in these processes. Also, we know that if you are more dependent on administrative processes via means-tested programs, then you are not going to experience positive outcomes because you experience more burdens on a daily basis. So what can we do about these administrative burdens? And here's some very general suggestions here. One obvious idea is that we simply talk more about them. Part of the power of administrative burdens is that even though all of us have some negative story of a government encounter that didn't go well, we don't really think about these as a policy phenomenon that we study and analyze and try to fix. And so part of the goal here is just to make these administrative burdens more visible as a policy output that we try to fix. We should also recognize that burdens are constructed. That is to say that they're the result of political and administrative choices. And sometimes these choices are unconscious. We simply say, we've always done it this way and we're not going to change anything. And sometimes political actors will deliberately impose more hassles in the program, perhaps because they want to access or increase some other value, such as minimizing fraud. And these are legitimate concerns that policy actors have. But they need to understand the trade-offs between, for example, efforts to minimize fraud and whether that increases burdens on individuals in a way that reduces access to programs. So our general advice to government is that you think about the costs as well as benefits in burdens and policy design. We're not saying that all burdens are bad or that it's possible to design a government with no burdens, but that we're more explicit in understanding when you impose some sort of state action that's likely to increase burdens, that you think clearly about how this is going to matter. We also think government should know more about the effects of burdens on different subgroups from an equality perspective. And this might be things related to race or income, but it might also be related to things like disability status or health status that might make, we know with good evidence, that's going to matter to people's ability to manage processes. Cass Sunstein, who's also written about this topic, uses the term sludge audits to describe the idea of having a routine process where people within government measure, identify, and reduce burdens. And we could also think about, because so much of our government is provided by third-party actors, embedding in contracts with those actors some measure of administrative burdens. And this could be as simple as surveys of clients about whether the processes worked for them or didn't. All of this is occurring in a context where I think there's been more interest in this topic than I've ever seen. And so some of this is occurring within the executive branch. President Biden signed an executive order on customer experience that very clearly called out administrative burdens. We've also seen the Office of Information and Regulatory Affairs within the Office of Management and Budget prioritize burden reduction. And for policymakers who are interested in doing something here, there is sort of a toolbox of solutions that's emerging. Some of this comes from behavioral science. So we might think about nudges here, and here nudges, we typically mean informational nudges. So giving people a text message that might tell them, hey, did you know you're eligible for this program? Or, hey, you have a deadline coming up to complete some administrative task. And these are very easy and popular to implement. And so the reason is they don't require government to do much to change its underlying processes. It's relatively inexpensive to send out text messages. And they do, in some cases, have effects. They're particularly going to matter in cases where learning costs is a big problem. But the size of these effects tends to be relatively small. So they might increase participation by 2 or 3 percentage points on average. Another solution here is simply to simplify administrative processes as they're experienced by individuals. And this is more complicated, more difficult, and governments are stepping their toe into this world pretty gingerly. But it requires a whole skill set like human-centered design, customer experience, officials, monitoring where people are struggling in administrative processes, and then redesigning those processes. A third solution is that the process stays the same and we just provide more help to people. And that is partly what caseworkers do all the time, is they help them manage through broken processes. Or, for example, if we hire navigators for particular programs, again, the idea is the program itself is so complex that you need specialists on board who are going to help you negotiate this process. And the fourth major tool in the toolbox here is shifting burdens onto the state. And so here I'm thinking of auto-enrollment as a potential solution here. This is sometimes called a nudge, but it's such a powerful nudge that I think it is in its own category. And so if you think about something like ex parte renewal of benefits in Medicaid, so when the state can identify that this individual is relatively clearly eligible for a program, rather than asking them to confirm that eligibility through a renewal process, it just goes ahead and renews those individuals. And critical in this tool is the ability of the states to leverage administrative data and to use technology to do so. And those are two conditions that governments are not always good about maximizing. All of this implies a certain set of organizational capacities, governmental priorities, and political culture to make this happen. And we do see examples of it here and there, and we do see more attention to this topic than we have in the past. But it does suggest that we take seriously this as a project for basically overhauling state capacity to make it more accessible to the public, or to, in other words, put the public back at the heart of public services. So that's my discussion. I'm looking forward to hearing about your experiences and taking your questions, and I'll stop there.
Awesome, Professor Moynihan, thank you so much. Just coming across your work, kind of post casework for me, was just incredibly validating and feeling like I had language to articulate some of what I had been seeing before. So I hope that's a shared experience for folks on this call. And actually, just digging in on that question about shared language. Again, it was validating and helpful for me to understand those categories. But can you talk about just is there value that you've seen as you've been doing this work of kind of the executive branch, legislative branch, academia, advocacy groups all starting to use that shared language and those shared categories for understanding administrative burden?
Yeah, I absolutely think there is. So let me sort of give a couple of examples here. There's been a long research agenda on frictions, right? From economics, for example, they talk about transaction costs a lot. But that long-term framework hasn't generated the type of attention to people's experiences that the discussion of administrative burdens has. And I think that is because it takes the extra step of trying to think about what those costs are, the learning costs, the compliance costs, and psychological costs. And we hosted on the Georgetown campus earlier this year during the summer some folks from OMB, where you had senior officials there speak to the importance of language as being a tool that makes more likely that these reforms can gain momentum. And so in particular, you see this language becoming embedded in Paperwork Reduction Act guidance, where they specify those particular types of costs. And then agencies have to pay attention to that. Or for example, if you're asking members of the public to write a comment about an administrative process, being able to use the term administrative burdens or being able to talk about the three particular types of costs gives you a hook to tie what you're doing to clearly express policy priorities within the executive branch. And so, all too often, changing government depends upon hitching your idea onto a wagon that already has some momentum. And I think there is some momentum behind this idea of both customer experience and administrative burdens. And so it allows people who are interested in making processes work better, be simpler, be more accessible to say, I know where this goes now. I know how to talk about this problem. I know how to explain to agencies, oh, this is a priority for the president, or this is required under Circular A11 or new Paperwork Reduction Act guidance. It gives a sense of priority to these activities.
That's wonderful. I can actually dig in on the PRA question, because I think last week when we talked to Jen Palka, she brought this up as kind of an example of how well-intentioned legislation has had an opposite effect in really preventing agencies from doing that good user research. But it sounds like you see a more optimistic route for PRA reform. Can you just walk us, give 10,000-foot view, what is PRA and how can it be used to improve this stuff?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I've learned so much about the Paperwork Reduction Act in the last couple of years, because this has become the primary vehicle by which the Biden administration, at least, is getting the attention of agencies around this topic. So the Paperwork Reduction Act is an old law. It's been updated a couple of times. The explicit intention of the Paperwork Reduction Act is to reduce paperwork on members of the public. And so anytime you pick up a federal form, you might see in the bottom corner some language that suggests it's going to take you 15 minutes or an hour or some amount of time to complete the form. That's the Paperwork Reduction Act. My sense is historically the energy and momentum around paperwork reduction in OIRA, or the Office of Management and Budget, has been more centered on cost-benefit analysis of regulations, whereas paperwork reduction on ordinary citizens has been a secondary concern. And that is something that I do feel has changed. And so in guidance that was shared in April of last year, OIRA sent out to federal agencies an update that said, here's how you should now think about the Paperwork Reduction Act. It's not just the 15 minutes it takes to complete a form, it's also the learning costs, it's also the pulling together documentation, it's also the psychological costs. And you should think about how to measure that in your particular program. And so because this is a government-wide mandate, every agency has to pay attention to this. Every agency has a desk officer whose job it is to monitor Paperwork Reduction Act implementation. And so there's an existing infrastructure across government that is already supposed to be doing this. So I think thematically, the new guidance is really helpful in making this a priority. I think the concern that Jen has had, and it's one that I share as well, is that part of reducing administrative burdens is understanding people's experience of government. And there's lots of different ways you can do that. You can engage in surveys, you can engage in observation of users, you can do focus groups. One hitch with the Paperwork Reduction Act is that if you survey more than, I think it's 10 people, you have to get clearance from OIRA to do so. And so you have to complete a paperwork process to reduce paperwork on the public. Now, there are some ways around this, but they still involve paperwork. So for example, OMB has something called a generic clearance process, where an agency will say, we're going to do a type of research that's going to involve these type of questions over time, and it's going to be repetitive and ongoing. And if you do that, then it's a lot less onerous. You simply have to say, here's a survey we're planning to use, and then within 5 days, OIRA has to respond to you or not. But you have to get to that point where you get generic clearance. And I think Jen's perspective, and it's one I would share and concur, is that if Congress was to update the Paperwork Reduction Act, one thing they could do would be exempt user research and just let people whose purpose is to make processes work better collect data without having to do a mother may I with OIRA in the center of government.
I love it. So if anyone is looking for a signature legislative achievement for their boss, it's like we have some good ideas. I want to address the question we just got from Whitney, because it is such a wonderful question. Whitney asks, during the pandemic, some programs simplified application processes or allowed self-attestations instead of requiring documents. Now agencies are looking back and seeing that a fair amount of fraud happened in these programs. It seems like they're actually taking this as a lesson on why more administrative burden is needed. So how can agencies balance that need to avoid fraud with the desire to avoid excessive administrative burden? Love your thoughts.
Yeah, so I think there's a couple of different categories here of lessons from the pandemic. And I do think there are some lessons that hopefully will stick. The degree of risk around fraud depends partly on the program. And there are clearly cases, unemployment insurance is probably the strongest case, where there were examples of individual fraud that was taking place. And so the lesson there is, I think you need stronger identification verification processes in place. And there's basically two approaches here. One is government contracts with private vendors of identification processes like ID.me, or people sign up with login.gov, which is used across a variety of federal services, and some states are starting to use it as well now. I'm more of a fan of login.gov because they have paid more attention to potential discriminatory impact of facial recognition on minority groups, where it simply does not work as well. And also with login.gov, if your digital experience of trying to sign up with them doesn't work, you can go to a post office and the federal official will make sure you get signed up. And so it has this sort of public value of being accessible for everyone, even though you do have to take a couple of extra steps. So I think clearly there are certain situations where you need something like login.gov to verify that people are who they say they are, to minimize potential fraud. I think there are other cases where the government already has that information, right? And something like the expansion of the child tax credit provided lots of resources to lots of people. You could also add to this the checks that were mailed out to people during the pandemic. And that worked with, I think, pretty little fraud. Lots of money was given to the right people because the government already knew who they were. And it wasn't vulnerable to these sort of fraudulent claims or, criminal operations manipulating the process. So I think in general, where the government can create credible, clearly well-defined connections with individuals where they have a high degree of confidence in who those individuals are, it allows them to reduce burdens quite a bit. In cases where they really need to verify people are who they say they are or face legitimate concerns about fraud, they have to think about ways to identify people that themselves are not terribly burdensome, and so that you don't have to set up like 52 logins anytime you interact with an individual government program.
It makes a lot of sense. And it's been interesting kind of following the login.gov saga over the last couple of months. But that's I really appreciate that point. And maybe there's a little bit of subtext in Whitney's question that I want to draw out, which is and you addressed this a little bit in your talk, there is so much momentum gathering in the executive branch for reducing administrative burdens, and Congress is present on this. Caseworkers are out in the districts and states jumping up and down, waving their arms, saying, this is what our constituents are handling. Can we do something here? But it seems like Congress is a little bit absent from that momentum flow on fixing administrative burden. I'm curious if you'd agree with that assessment, and if so, how would it be best for Congress to get involved in an ideal world? What happens?
Yeah, I would agree with that. And I think, maybe this is partly just the nature of Congress, which is that it is a decentralized body, whereas the executive branch can reflect the interests of the president and also career staff who've been working on customer experience issues in different ways since the first Bush administration. And so there's sort of an institutional memory there that's been building up over time. I have, occasionally talked to staff members in Congress. There are certainly people who are interested and attentive to this, but I haven't seen something that would look like a congressional agenda to move forward on this. That would be terrific. I think there are different ways that could occur. Without legislation, Congress has an important oversight function. And so one thing I've heard when talking to people in federal agencies is that they would love to have more questions about customer experience, right? And so if you get hauled into Congress, you will typically get questions about something that went wrong, right? Or some unique or odd scandal that occurred, but you're less likely to get attention to sort of routine performance metrics. And I think until Congress shifts its oversight to be more about like how well are you serving the public on a routine basis versus tell us about the scandal that happened last week, there's always going to be a mismatch in what agencies are being asked to do in terms of reducing burdens and their actual political incentives when they have a relationship with Congress. Now, if Congress was to engage in legislation, there are a bunch of things it could do. We've talked about updating the Paperwork Reduction Act. I think much of the architecture that the Biden administration has put in place through its executive orders could easily be put into law. Another lift Congress could undertake is to revisit the way in which the federal government thinks about data sharing. And so that the Privacy Act comes from the 1970s, and there's some very strong privacy advocates on the Hill, and certainly privacy is a really important value. But I don't think the existing architecture reflects the positive opportunities that use of data could realize for members of the public. And so, every day when we go online, we give away our data for minimal benefits. but we have very strong constraints on allowing government to use our data to help us. And so a piece of legislation that was built around the general principle that government should be allowed to use data that it has about you in positive domains where it's helping you, I think probably would be reasonably popular with most constituents. And there are ways in which you could temper that. You could require that people have to check a box, or that you provide information about how data is used. And so, for example, the Biden administration's latest loan reduction policy, SAVE, will auto-renew people every year into that program, because what it was finding is that every year people would forget to sign up for the program, and then they would get kicked out of the loan reduction aspect of the income-driven program that they had previously said we want to be part of, even though almost no one had become ineligible. So using something like administrative data to simply sweep away that small but important administrative burden allows people to continue on a path that they previously indicated that they want to be on. So Congress could absolutely make a massive difference in the capacity of the administration to do good things by giving it more room in the use of administrative data.
It's wonderful to hear an optimistic vision for how Congress can handle data. I'm wondering too, if kind of your perspective on, this came up last week when we were talking to Max Guinness. Part of the issue seems to be that so many of the big public benefits programs are kind of siloed within Congress too. So it's, this committee has jurisdiction over one program, and this committee has jurisdiction over another, and there's no kind of central eyeballs on how all of these interact, and kind of what data does the IRS have that Social Security could make use of, or the VA could make use of, Department of Education. Are there any solutions that you've seen or heard of that might make some inroads and kind of helping create some visibility across multiple programs?
No, I think that you were correct in that assessment, and that has to do with the the fundamental structure of Congress and the ways in which committees are organized. Obviously, we do have some government-wide committees whose job it is to think about how government functions as a whole, and I would hope that they would play more of a role in this space. And Representative Kilmer talked a little bit about some potential pilots that they are interested in undertaking. But again, they are often, those committees will tend to devolve towards partisan scorekeeping, where they're looking for an oversight hearing that's gotcha with the party in power if the other party is controlling those committees, rather than how do we make government work more effectively. The Future Act in the area of education, I think, has been a positive piece of legislation that was very bipartisan and is starting to pay off now, and allowing the use of data for people who borrow for educational purposes. So I think that is like one positive model that reiterates that when you actually talk to people on both sides of the aisle, there is relatively bipartisan support for the notion that services should not be incredibly complex and they shouldn't be unnecessarily burdensome. People might disagree a little bit about what is necessary or unnecessary, but being burdensome just for the point of being burdensome, I think most members of the public don't agree with that. And we have some survey work where we've polled members of the public and we've asked them about the way in which SNAP or Medicaid could be run. And you find that across parties, for most of these options, things like using administrative data to pre-fill forms or to auto-renew people's benefits, there's pretty strong support for that. Like that is not like a partisan space in the way some other topics are.
And I think caseworkers definitely know and experience that. It's every member of Congress has a casework team, and the level of bipartisan cooperation is just always something that's super inspiring. That's wonderful. Going back to data for a second, I wonder if I could kind of maybe ask you to think about the future here with us. So I know there's the Biden administration has just put out the gigantic executive order on AI, or not executive order, but a suite of forecasting on AI and requiring agencies to start thinking about the future impact of AI on things like automating benefits decisions. I'm just curious how optimistic you are.
Yeah, so we are in like the gold rush phase of AI, and it has enormous interest. This is a topic that I think members of Congress are very interested in, right? Or policymakers in general, because once you've gone on ChatGPT, you've sort of seen some of the possibilities there, and there is a wow factor. With that Wild West aspect, there's also going to be a lot of vendors who are going to sell AI as a solution to whatever ails a particular government agency or program. I am cautiously optimistic, but with a lot of caveats. So I think AI can help in a couple of ways. One is reducing learning costs, right? So if you think about using large language models that would allow members of the public to ask a question using their own language to a bot that will tell them about eligibility, or will prompt them with questions that will allow them the bot to fill a form. That is a way in which one form of AI can help people on the front end. And so I think there's going to be testing of this, and there's going to be failures, and there's going to be eventually successes, and we should really care about the evidence behind when these are deployed in practice. But I am optimistic that there is real improvements to be made there. The second aspect of AI we should think about is the use of AI for decision-making, specifically the use of algorithms to make judgments about things like eligibility. And there, I think there is potential, but there is a lot of political risk. And if it goes wrong, people are going to be upset. One thing I feel fairly confident about is that people get angrier about algorithms that fail than they get about humans that fail. And I think that's partly because when algorithms fail, they can do it at a much broader scale than individual humans who are doing a bad job. And we see some examples in other countries. People want to Google robo-debt. That's a case in Australia, or the Dutch child benefits, where these algorithmic decision-making AIs were basically trying to claw back resources from individuals that they believed had engaged in fraud, incorrectly, caused a lot of pain for families, and at least in the case of the Netherlands, the resulting scandal saw the government collapse, right? And so I think there's a very big potential tail of political risk that people who are enthusiastic about this don't quite understand at this point. And one of the lessons from those cases is that you absolutely have to have some way of monitoring and regulating the algorithmic decision-making AI, where you know what the outcomes are, you audit it on a regular basis, and you have human beings who are in the loop, who can flag if things do not look right, or who can respond to client concerns when they say, hey, I think something has gone wrong here. Because that was not the case in the robo-debt or the Dutch childcare benefit example that I mentioned.
So one way or another, there will always be caseworkers there to answer the phone when folks think that the decision-making algorithm has gone.
For purposes of judgment and for purposes of accountability, humans will still be essential in how we distribute public services.
Absolutely. But I find the Dutch example so interesting because it kind of underscores the impact here, just the stakes of getting these benefit programs right, and how important that expertise is that caseworkers have for just what is the constituent experience of interacting with government, and how does that build or reduce trust overall? That's really interesting.
Yeah, and you know, as human beings, we're more attentive to cases of failure rather than successes, and this is partly why Congress does like to pay attention to scandals when it's engaged in its oversight function. And so people will generally not have a problem with AI when it's working well, but when it screws up, that's when it's going to become a major accountability issue for policymakers.
Which actually seamlessly leads to something I really wanted to ask you about, which is kind of the positive examples. Again, our talk with Jen last week, she emphasized just one of the things Congress can do is really lift up places where agencies are doing this right, and making big gains to just make this easier. Anything that stood out to you recently for places that Congress can kind of try to look at and replicate?
Yeah, there are a couple, I think, of fairly well-established star pupils in this area. One is the VA. So since 2014, when there was a scandal around wait times, VA has vastly improved its customer experience. And that's partly because VA invested a ton in customer experience officials, right? So it has about 300 staff who just work on customer experience. They measure client experience intensely. They have quarterly reports about how happy people are with services, and they can tell you which are leading and which are lagging units across the country. And VA, VA also is a well-resourced, bipartisan support, sympathetic client group. And so this is an agency that has everything that they need to do the job well, and they really do seem to be doing quite well. That they've gone from this sort of scandal-ridden agency in 2014 to one that other agencies are looking to now as they ramp up their investments in customer experience. The second is DHS, and they have set themselves a target of reducing the amount of time people spend in interacting with their services by 10%, and they've already exceeded that. And I think the lesson there is there's probably a lot of low-hanging fruit for agencies that really do want to devote effort to this. The second lesson is that targets matter, and so this is one way that you can prioritize attention to burden reduction. And the third is that I think the leadership there just gets it. They really care about this as an issue. And so they have, I mentioned earlier, Cass Sunstein now works at DHS. They have a leadership team that is centered on how do you reduce burdens in lots of different services. And so that if you get those combination of things, it's more likely that you have successes. The final thing I'll say when thinking about examples is that we tend to maybe focus a lot on the federal level. And I think the federal government has had a head start on this. States are lagging a little bit, but there is more interest in this topic now, whether it's executive orders on reducing administrative burden. So New York State passed one of those, building up digital service teams. So New Jersey and Colorado also have very good digital service teams. And I do think we're starting to see more positive examples come from that space as well. And that's really important because of the nature of the US system of government, so much of our services, even federal services, are delivered at the state level. And so getting just the federal level right is not going to solve the problem if you don't have real buy-in and capacity at the state level as well.
We are just about at time, so I just want to say, Professor Moynihan, thank you so much again for taking the time to join us today and sharing more about your work and just for the work itself, and just again how validating and helpful this is for caseworkers, everybody else working on how government works. We really appreciate it.
My pleasure, and thanks so much to everyone who's actually doing the casework. It's great to have a chance to talk to you.
Awesome. Thank you again. And then if folks are interested, they can follow your Substack, right, which is called Can We Still Govern?
Yep, free to sign up. So please go ahead and do that. And every week I talk about issues related to government or speech or something that's on my mind.
And it is such a good read. Cannot recommend it enough. And then, folks, as always, all of our casework resources are available at popvox.org/casework. We have manual chapters for caseworkers. We have short pieces of writing on things to be aware of. We have our newsletter. If you are not on that list, feel free to shoot me an email. And I am always around for comments, questions, suggestions for future webinars, future chapters, and reachable at ann@popvox.org. Y'all, thank you so much again for joining us, and everyone have a safe and wonderful, well-deserved Thanksgiving holiday rest. Thank you so much.